Fans of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics love to talk about the tender care that children were surrounded with in the land of the Soviets. They say clubs, hobby groups, pioneer houses, children's camps, everything was for the younger generation. Some of this was indeed true, but there were also other facts that people preferred to keep silent about. Now I'm talking about orphanages and boarding schools, which were better to avoid because terrible things happened there and children lived in absolutely inhumane conditions. The problem of homelessness existed throughout the entire history of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, but it was especially acute in the first decades of Soviet power. It can't be said that the authorities did nothing to address this issue, but their approaches were so far from the principles of humanism and humanity that they made the fate of these unfortunate children even harder. In this episode, we'll talk about how the Soviet Union fought against homelessness, what conditions orphans lived in at children's homes, and why they regularly wrote complaints to anyone they could, even to Comrade Stalin. Now you'll find out how children of enemies of the people were treated in boarding schools, and why many of them went straight from the orphanage to the camps. My name is Semyon, and I declare the How Did They Live segment open. Let's begin. Waves of homelessness in Soviet history. Homelessness is a serious social problem when children are left to live on the streets. It becomes especially acute during wars, revolutions, and civil conflicts. The past century was especially rich in various upheavals, so homelessness became an unprecedentedly widespread phenomenon. Moreover, in Soviet history, several waves of homelessness can be identified. The first of these was caused by World War I and the Civil War, and occurred in the early 1920s. At that time, about 7 million children ended up on the streets. The next surge of homelessness occurred in the mid-1930s, caused by brutal collectivization and mass repressions, which left millions of children without parents. And the last major wave occurred during the years of World War II and the post-war period. It must be said that the Bolsheviks fought homelessness decisively. Very quickly, a whole system of orphanages and shelters was organized in the country, overseen by Felix Dzerzhinsky and his all-powerful agency. A whole group of talented educators emerged who worked with homeless children, the most famous of whom, of course, was Anton Makarenko, who created an entire system for working with orphans. As a result of these efforts, by the early 1930s, the number of homeless children had decreased from 7 million to 150,000. However, at the same time, the makeup of the children changed significantly. Instead of yesterday's homeless children, the children of kulaks and the repressed began to arrive. After the war began, the number of homeless children in the country sharply increased again, and by 1945 it exceeded 800,000 people. By 1950, there were 6,543 orphanages in the Soviet Union, housing 637,000 minors. 8 years later, their number had decreased to 375,000. By the 1960s, homelessness among children as a mass phenomenon in the Soviet Union had been practically eliminated, and even the word homeless child disappeared from official documents. Although orphanages continued to operate, they now housed orphans as well as children from troubled families whose parents had been deprived of their rights. What was life like in Soviet orphanages in the 1920s and 1930s? Probably many older people have read the pedagogical novel, The Story of the Teacher and Educator Anton Makarenko. In the book, it immediately stands out how much care and warmth this teacher with a capital T shows toward his wards, the homeless children. Alas, in most orphanages of the 1920s and 1930s, the attitude toward the children was completely different. And this is not some kind of anti-Soviet propaganda, but real facts taken from inspection documents. Let's start with the fact that orphanages were often located in old, dilapidated buildings that were completely unsuitable for people to live in, especially small children. They had no heating, and for many years they went without repairs. Only a few orphanages had more or less decent furniture. For example, a report on inspections of children's institutions in the Volga region stated that there was a shortage of tables, benches, beds, and kitchen and dining utensils. The rooms in the middle, with a small number of children, require both routine and major repairs. And in the Saratov Children's Reception Center, the children slept 5 or 6 to a single bed. However, not everyone even got one. Correspondents reported that the children were naked, slept on the cold floor, healthy ones next to sick ones, including those with syphilis. There were no clothes or dishes, and everyone ate from the same bowl. Such a situation was typical not only for the hungry 1920s, but also for later periods. For example, in 1938, Deputy People's Commissar of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, Frinovsky, reported unsatisfactory conditions for children in orphanages in the Kostanay region. The children slept 3 to a bed, lived in barracks, and were constantly subjected to abuse by the caregivers. In one of the cafeterias, there were only 20 plates and 12 spoons for 212 children, and the situation with clothing and shoes was even worse. According to the waiters, in the mid-1920s, the state could provide for only half of the children in orphanages, and because of this, many children were unable to attend school. A similar situation existed with food supplies. Each region had its own nutrition standards for children in orphanages. In the 1930s, the situation improved, but another problem became acute: stealing. In some orphanages, the staff essentially lived at the expense of the children. Sometimes it got to the point where most of the food allocated to the orphanage was stolen by its management, and the children lived in hunger, stealing and begging to survive. Things were not much better when it came to medical care. Due to poor conditions, unsanitary environments, and inadequate nutrition, the children in the orphanages often got sick. The sick were not isolated from the healthy, which often led to real epidemics breaking out in the orphanages. Medical examinations of the children were rare, since there was a severe shortage of doctors. The catastrophic state of the orphanages led to a mass escape of children. They returned to the streets, formed gangs, and survived by stealing, begging, and prostitution. It should be noted that by the mid-1930s, the situation improved somewhat. Food supplies were established, orphanage children began to receive clothing and shoes, and medical supervision was organized. But overall, life for orphans in the orphanage depended on the integrity and professionalism of the institution's management, and unfortunately, there were major problems with this. Letters to the Kremlin. In the 1950s, an unusual phenomenon for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics began. Children from various orphanages started to write mass complaints directly to the Kremlin, to the highest authorities, reporting that the conditions in their institutions were little different from those in labor camps. In response to these reports, the Ministry of State Security of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics launched a large-scale investigation across the country, the results of which were shocking. The abuses turned out to be so widespread that the final report was classified as secret. It turned out that corruption and rampant theft prevailed in the orphanage system. The staff and management shamelessly stole from their wards, forcing them to go hungry and beg. Only during 1950 and 1951, 154 cases of embezzlement of socialist property were uncovered, causing the state a loss of 3 million rubles. The amounts stolen in individual orphanages were impressive. For example, the director of the Beloretsk orphanage, together with his accomplices from the staff, stole food, clothing, and money totaling 171,000 rubles. And the director of the Shakovsky orphanage in the Kirov region appropriated money and material assets worth more than 105,000 rubles. Facts of embezzlement of state funds, food, material assets, and abnormal occurrences in the care and upbringing of children also took place in orphanages in the Chelyabinsk, Ryazan, and Kemerovo regions. The management of the Zyryansky orphanage in the Tomsk region stole money and material assets worth 148,000 rubles. Moreover, inspections by local officials did not reveal any violations, because the auditors were simply bribed and turned a blind eye to everything. This story can be considered indicative, and here's why. The situation in orphanages in the capital, Republican, and regional centers was more or less normal. They were in the public eye, with the press and various delegations visiting frequently. But in the provinces, complete lawlessness flourished, which local authorities turned a blind eye to for bribes, and often they themselves took part in the schemes. As a result of the audit, dozens of criminal cases were opened, hundreds of people ended up behind bars, but this did not lead to any serious results. The next wave of inspections, which was carried out in 1959, revealed the same problems. Here's how the situation in the orphanages of the Udmurt Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic was described by the main Soviet Komsomol member, Semichastny. The orphanages are overcrowded. Most of them are located in unsuitable buildings. The orphanages are housed in wooden barrack-type structures that used to be camps for prisoners of war. Random people are recruited to work as caregivers. There is sexual abuse and beatings. However, the problems of Soviet orphanages were not limited to theft. The quality of the staff in these institutions also left much to be desired. That's putting it mildly. Judging by reports from that time, many of the teachers shouldn't have been allowed anywhere near children. Instead of educational work, they replaced it with outright terror against the orphans. In 1959, Marshal Voroshilov received a letter from the Slovenian orphanage in the Vitebsk region, in which a 14-year-old orphan complained about her nightmarish life. Dear Kliment Yefremovich Voroshilov, I don't have a mother or father. They have died, and my little brother and I are currently in an orphanage, but we are not doing well here. My little brother Oleg Rimkevich is beaten and pulled by the ears every day. Eva Yefimovna beats not only my brother, but also other kids like Valery Kapazniak. She beat him, locked him in the basement in shock, and yesterday beat him badly. She made Bueva, Nikolaeva, Kovzik, and Golenki kneel in the isolation room, beat the girls badly, stripped them naked, and locked them up in the bedroom. Often the little ones are not given food. Dear Kliment Yefremovich Voroshilov, I ask you, please pay attention to this so that we are not beaten anymore. The letter made the marshal furious, after which an inspection was sent to the orphanage, and it confirmed the complaints of the pupil. The guilty were punished. But of course, this did not change the overall situation, because abuse and violence against children were the main pillars of Soviet orphanages. This is confirmed by tens of thousands of testimonies. Here is another story for you. At the beginning of 1949, the guards detained 3 boys near the Kremlin walls who had run away from a Moscow region orphanage to ask for protection from Comrade Stalin. They complained that the caregivers beat them as punishment, starved them, put them in solitary confinement, poured water on them, tied them to beds, and even raped them. Yes, sexual abuse was practically the norm in Soviet orphanages. For example, the director of the Rozdestvensky orphanage in the Stavropol region forced 10 to 12-year-old girls to have sexual intercourse with him for a long time, using threats and force. And the teachers at the Baklushinsky boarding school almost openly encouraged teenage girls to cohabit. At the Kaptagaisky Sanatorium orphanage, the teachers appointed an 18-year-old boy to supervise the children, and he quickly turned the girls' section into his own harem. Later, a medical examination confirmed cases of rape of girls aged 10 to 12. Similar problems persisted in orphanages of the late Soviet Union. Judging by the memories of their former residents, the internal structure here was built according to the model of the criminal world or the Soviet army. Teachers left matters of discipline to the older kids, who maintained it. By abusing the younger ones, a kind of hazing developed, which suited the adults perfectly. However, violence from the educators towards the children was also commonplace. The children in orphanages, of course, protested, wrote complaints to various authorities, and even organized riots. One of the District Department of Public Education inspectors recalled, "I arrived at the Konstantinovsky orphanage and saw a terrible scene. All the windows were broken, the pillows were slashed, the pioneer leader was tied to the legs of a table, and the children were sitting on the roof singing. An unbreakable union, a bold director." However, all this helped little. Most often, the children simply ran away from their boarding schools, joined gangs, or begged on the streets. Children of enemies of the people. In Stalin's Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, there was another category of unfortunate children in orphanages, the children of the repressed. And although Stalin liked to repeat that a son is not responsible for his father, in reality the children of enemies of the people became outcasts. In August 1937, People's Commissar Yezov signed an order for an operation to repress the wives and children of traitors to the motherland. It stated that the wives of enemies of the people should be sent to camps for a term of 5 to 8 years, and children aged from 1 to 15 should be sent to orphanages. Moreover, brothers and sisters were to be separated in order to break all family ties. The authorities treated the children of traitors to the motherland with maximum harshness, considering them potential enemies, regardless of their gender or age. In orphanages, they received the worst clothing and food, and any disobedience was harshly suppressed, while physical violence was considered a necessary part of upbringing. The caregivers believed that boys and girls should pay for the crimes of their parents after reaching the age of 15. A child of an enemy of the people could be put on trial and sent to a camp for any violation. The children of famous Soviet military leaders, such as Uborovich, Yakir, and Gomarnik, went through orphanages, and in the 1940s all of them ended up in camps. A few words in conclusion. Orphanhood and homelessness are complex social problems that have no simple solutions. In the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, they tried to solve it through a system of orphanages with an extremely strict, almost prison-like regime. Nothing good came out of this. The children in orphanages did not acquire the necessary socialization skills and often entered adulthood with broken psyches. That's all from me. Thank you for your attention. See you in the next episode. Bye.